The American Creed. I believe in the United States of America as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, whose just powers are derived from the consent of the governed, a democracy in a republic, a sovereign nation of many sovereign states, a perfect union, one and inseparable, established upon those principles of freedom, equality, justice, and humanity, for which American patriots sacrificed their lives and fortunes. I therefore believe it is my duty to my country to love it, to support its Constitution, to obey its laws, to respect its flag, and to defend it against all enemies. Father, as we gather here together in this classroom, we ask that you guide our studies and lead us to understanding. We also ask that you protect the individuality of each student as they question and ponder your word in these matters. Thank you, Father, for this beautiful place of learning. We pray these words in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right. Welcome back to GW Bridge Academy and American Government class. We're going to be talking about Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, which delineates the executive branch of the United States government. Now, the primary role of the executive branch, and we will go over this with the vesting clause, is to execute the laws of the land. Okay, it is very important that you know that a president, which is the head of the executive branch and the head of the nation, does not have a pen and a phone to write law with, okay? He is not a legislator. He is the executive of the law. He will execute the law as it is supposed to be executed according to the laws that are written by Congress or the U.S. Constitution. The president is commonly referred to as the leader of the free world. Okay, that's a big name. But that does not convey any kind of sovereignty over the people, over the world, or over the government. The president is right there on level with the other branches of government, the other three branches of government. You've got the legislative, which we've talked about, the judicial branch, and you have the executive branch. Okay, so, and all of those three branches are underneath the United States Constitution. So our president is not above the Constitution. He also falls below the law. The President of the United States is a civil servant. Okay, while we have extreme respect for the office that he holds, he has to earn our respect as a president. So his performance does not necessarily equate with the respect that we give to the office. So that person that becomes and is elected as President of the United States has to earn our respect. That's how he gets elected primarily. And while he's in office, he has to continue to earn that respect by performing well and performing legally within the framework of the United States Constitution. That's very important to understand. Do not look at your civil leaders in a hierarchy kind of way that puts you, underneath them. We are underneath the respectful offices that they hold, but they are people equal. We are equal to them as if they were any other citizen of the United States. And there are several different names that the president has been kind of thrown. Some of them are informal, some of them are a little more formal. Obviously, he's considered the President of the United States. But sometimes he can be referred to as having that bully pulpit because his political influence is so large and so widespread. With reference to Congress and congressmen, he kind of holds that bully pulpit, and so he can go around the nation pushing his agenda, and that has a lot of influence. That's an important thing to remember. The leader of the free world, okay? That doesn't mean he's, king of the world. That does not mean that. And it's not an official name. But what it implies to you is that America is considered the strongest nation militarily, economically, in the world. And it's just the God honest truth. I mean, we have advanced to that level, and we take that responsibility very seriously. The president is also considered the leader of the political party that he was nominated from. So, say for instance today, President Trump is considered the leader of the Republican Party because that is the ticket at which he was elected to. Now, these unofficial titles carry a lot of weight in the minds of men, and they carry a lot of influence and power with them. But the goal is you want to make sure that when you go to the polls, you're electing a person that most closely represents the moral and ethical traits that can withstand incredible amounts of influence. You want that person to be able to withstand corruption because they encounter that corruption constantly while in office. You want him to execute the duties necessary with skill and with purpose. These are the qualities you're looking for in the United States president. All right, let's get on with Article 2, which is going to give us the construction of the executive branch and its expressed powers. So in our lineup, we've had the legislative branch in Article 1. The executive branch will be in this Article 2. And then next we will have Article 3, which will talk to us about the judicial branch. Okay, just like the legislative vesting clause, there is an executive vesting clause, and it reads, "The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America." Executive meaning the body or person who carries the laws into effect or superintends the enforcement of them. And again, that's from 1828 Webster's Dictionary. The duty of the president is to execute the laws of the nation and of those created by Congress. He has to take an oath, and that oath is as follows. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Okay, that is the oath of office for the President of the United States. Now, the President holds office for 4 years, and he holds that office together with the Vice President that ran during the election with him. Those two offices, those two people that hold those two offices must be from different states. And again, this kind of lends itself to let's not centralize power around the interest of one state. We're going to require that two of the highest office holding positions in the United States are at least going to be coming from different places of residence. They must be natural-born citizens. You cannot be an immigrant that has been naturalized in the United States and run for president. They must have reached an age of 35 years or older, and you must have lived in the United States for at least the past 14 years. There are 3 amendments that significantly alter this Section 1 of Article 2. The 12th, the 20th, and the 25th Amendment. They affect how the president is elected, and they also affect how succession is conducted in the case of the removal of the president through impeachment in case of the death of the president, and one of these was specifically responding to the assassination of President Kennedy, or the resignation or the inability of a president to serve. And of course, Nixon resigned from office, and there was a provision for how that transfer of power would take place in that case as well. Section 1 also lays out the structure of the Electoral College, which was created for the sole purpose of electing the president and the vice president. The reason why they wanted to create this kind of wide net of electors is because they were trying to prevent this central collection of power. They didn't want one meeting place, one geographic meeting place where all the electors were, just for the sake of making this vote, because that setup would have encouraged an easy access to collusion, to the buying and selling of votes. They didn't want there to be political powers kind of preying upon these electors to persuade them to vote one way or the other, or intimidate them. So if you kind of scatter people out, it really kind of weakens that temptation. All right, let's talk about the electors themselves. They kind of hold this mini office in the government. So there's going to be there are some rules around who they can be and who they can't be. Electors cannot be a senator or a representative, and they cannot be a person that holds an office in the federal government. From there, it kind of steps down to the state level, where the state set up rules for the electors, and the political parties within those states, those parties choose their electors. So we don't want to get too much in the weeds of how all of that happens. I mean, that's a good study if you're really interested in election law. Most of the interest about the Electoral College resurfaces, of course, every presidential election. And so, and there's 4 years between that. So, there's not very many times where we're talking about this issue, but when we do, it's very important, because when you're watching on election night, you're trying to understand, okay, what? There's like the popular vote, and then there's the Electoral College, and what happens on election night. When you go to the polls and you vote for your candidate for president, you are essentially electing electors for this college that will then vote on who is president. Now, that sounds a little bizarre, but it really does work, and there really hasn't been too much of a problem with it over the years. It's just kind of hard to understand. You're basically sending a representative to vote for you. Let's start by just talking about how many electors there are and how they're divided up, and then what happens on election night. So there are 538 electors, and that number is a component of 3 different numbers. There are electors for every seat in the House of Representatives, so that's 435. And that means, so Texas has more than Rhode Island, because Texas has more representatives than Rhode Island. So Texas is a more valuable, state to win for a candidate rather than Rhode Island, because you're going to get so many more electoral votes out of that state. That's the 435. And then you add 100 for all the Senate seats. So all the states are going to have, obviously, 2 electors for each one of those states. And then the 23rd Amendment added 3 more for the District of Columbia. So there was an amendment to the Constitution to give those people that resided in the District of Columbia to have 3 electoral votes. Okay, when you add all that up, that's 538. Now you take that number, 538, and that's going to be divided up among the 50 states. Each state, of course, is getting the number of electors that is basically the sum of the number of representative seats they have, and plus their 2 senators. The states with the most electors are California, that has 55, Texas has 38, New York has 29, Florida has 29, Illinois has 20, and Pennsylvania has 20 as well. Well, let's take, for instance, California versus Texas in this last election. Two large states that are very rich in electors and really kind of bump up that number on an election night for a candidate. California now tends to lean Democratic. So Hillary won that state, and she probably didn't even need to spend time in that state because it was so much expected that she was going to capture those votes from California. And Trump was probably expecting, I'm going to get Texas because Texas is pretty conservative and tends to lean more Republican. So he pretty much had Texas wrapped up. He knew he was going to be able to capture Texas. But there's states that they call the battleground states where it's just, it's a flip of the coin. You've got to go in there ahead of the election and try to win over those votes, because the more votes you get and the popular vote you get, that you have a higher chance of tipping the scale and grabbing all those electors. Some of the states split up their electors, but for the most part, if you win the popular vote, you get all of, winner take all those electors from that state. So when there's a battleground state, you'll notice there's a lot of heavy campaigning going on in those states. Now, this all comes to a head on election night when you're sitting there watching the returns and you're watching for that magic number to come up, that 270, because if a candidate has 270 electoral votes, then he has reached that simple majority needed of the electoral college votes to win the presidency. So if on election night that candidate wins enough of those states to tip his electoral vote count up to 270 or above, he has won the presidency. And that is exactly what happened in this past one when Trump won. Although it was a little unexpected, because what they were pushing, what the media was pushing, is they were expecting Hillary to win because their polling data was showing that she had more, she had somehow gained more popular votes in those states according to their polls. But of course, what actually happened on election night was not that. What actually happened was that Trump had pulled in votes that they didn't account for in their polling. And I honestly think that's kind of how they got taken by surprise. Let's look at the map of the popular vote for 2016 by county. If you look at this map, you will see that it's red in all the areas where it's more rural areas, and it's blue where there's more urban area, concentrations of people. Red indicates Republican votes, and blue indicates Democratic votes. So as you can see, there were more Republican votes in those rural areas, and there were more Democratic votes in those blue areas, which are primarily high urban areas, or in the case of this map, a lot of the border area, because immigration was such a big issue during the campaign, that border area along Mexico is highly Democratic. Okay, now look over at the Electoral College result map by state. I think this is where the national media had their guffaw moment, where they're just like dumbfounded, because they weren't able to predict how these and you can't predict. I mean, you really can't until election night, but they try very hard. what they didn't account for is they would go into these large cities and take this polling data about, who are you going to vote for, and then so their count indicated that Hillary had more votes because they kept grabbing votes from probably more concentrated areas of people. Well, looking back at the popular vote election result, you can see that probably not a lot of this polling was going on in these rural areas, because you're just not going to get much bang for your buck as a media outlet going to these rural areas and asking a couple of people who they're going to vote for. You're just going to get more bang for your buck in those urban areas. So they had tallied a lot of these states in Hillary's column, but that's not what happened. What happened was Trump brought out an unprecedented amount of rural voters. He brought out a lot of new voters, actually. And they came from those rural areas that maybe don't typically vote. So he was able to capture more of the vote in some of these states than Hillary did. Now, if you look at the totals for the whole nation, Hillary Clinton actually captured more popular votes than Trump did by like 3 million. But that was irrelevant because on the state level, in those states, Trump had managed to, in more states, capture more of the popular vote, and therefore, in a lot of these winner-take-all states, he was able to take all of those electoral college votes. And so even though she had more popular votes on the national level, when you collected all those together, she didn't have enough in each one of these individual states to actually capture the electoral college votes of those states. And when it all got added up at the end, Trump won the electoral vote, and therefore he won the presidency. So from a media perspective, their whole analysis fell apart. And that's why you kind of saw the media just, unraveling as the night was going on, because, they were caught off guard by these electoral votes coming back for Trump. And if you stayed up late enough that night to watch Trump come in and accept the presidency and the election results, he looked just as surprised as the media did. So that was an extremely interesting display of the Electoral College at work. And I think it's important to note that this previous election had the intended result that the founders had originally designed. They really understood, a buckshot versus a birdshot. They did not want candidates to take their campaigning and only go to big concentrations of people and win over all those votes and be able to carry the election that way. They wanted candidates to get out to all of the people. They didn't want people in the urban outlying areas to be ignored. They wanted people to get out there, get out to the other, don't just go to the electoral rich states, and buy those up, with your campaigning time and then go home and win the election. They really wanted to make it extremely difficult to be able to ignore the entire rest of the nation. So I think that was very well captured on election night this past November. And I just want to take one more look at the numbers so that you understand. Remember, we have 538 electoral votes. They're distributed out by population to the states. So on election night, you have 538 potential electoral votes. If there are two strong candidates, as there typically are, usually a third-party candidate doesn't have a lot of weight, but sometimes they can really throw off these numbers. If there are two powerful candidates, you divide that by 2, that's 269. You add 1, that pushes you over the halfway mark. That's why 270 is that magic number. Okay, I think we're done beating that dead horse. All right, next slide. We're going to go into section 2, and that these are the enumerated powers of the presidency. Right out of the gate, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and of the state militias. So the president is the highest ranking commander of the armed forces, and that is extremely significant. There's no more delineated hierarchy of power than there is in the armed forces. And who your president is, who your ranking commander is, really has a lot of influence on how the military is going to be run. I mean, for the most part, they're not going to change too many things up, but if you have a president that has sat in office for quite a long time, they can have a pretty dramatic effect on how our military is run. I think the most powerful dichotomy set forth about this concept of commander-in-chief is pretty obvious to me with the change of power from President Obama to President Trump. Under President Obama, he was president for 8 years, and that means he was the commander over our military for 8 years. That's a lot of time to set the tone for our military forces. And one of the biggest complaints was this whole concept of, stand down theory. If you talk to a lot of military that have served recently, you're going to hear this stand down term quite a bit. And basically what that meant was you don't shoot unless you're shot at. Now, I believe that kind of tactic weakens a military. That's a purely defensive posture. And that doesn't really work when you're dealing with people that are aggressive towards you. The most successful militaries we've had in this country are the ones that speak softly, but they carry a big gun. Okay, because they're telling you, look, I'm not the aggressor, but if you so much as show any aggression to me or threaten what I'm trying to protect, this gun is going to be pointed towards you. That's a much more effective protection, to keep the wolf away from the door rather than saying, okay, wolf, well, you want to come in? Well, if you're going to come in, don't hurt anybody. We'll let you in, but don't hurt anybody. Well, then you have the wolf in the door, okay? And now everybody's at risk. So you can see right out of the gate here with the expressed powers of the executive branch, the president being the commander-in-chief of the armed forces is a extremely powerful position and can set the tone for whether we are in a protective situation or if we're just more in a defensive stance. Okay, moving on. The power to the president has the power to grant reprieves, and that means essentially he's going to cancel whatever punishment was scheduled for this person. And he has the right to grant a pardon to someone who's been charged with something, and basically he's saying that person is forgiven. And this just happened recently with Trump. President Trump pardoned Sheriff Arpaio from Arizona, who was charged with racially profiling Latinos with regard to illegal immigration and identifying possible illegal immigrants. The only thing the president can't do is stop an impeachment. He certainly can't achieve that end result. Next power, he can make treaties with other countries, but he has to have 2/3 approval from the Senate to do that. He can nominate ambassadors, public ministers, consuls, Supreme Court judges. But again, a lot of these offices have to have Senate approval, 2/3 vote in the Senate to approve these appointments. And another power that the president has is to be able to make vacancy appointments, which basically means there needs to be an appointment made because someone has vacated that position, but he can make that when the Senate is in recess, and so there doesn't have to be a 2/3 approval. That's pretty powerful, and that has been abused a bit at times. After the Commander-in-Chief clause, it reads exactly, he may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. Now, this seems pretty benign because basically what they were trying to allow the president to do was, seek opinions from his advisors. And these were advisors that he chose. But what this has turned into is this massive bureaucratic system called the executive branch. So, and that's going to include, the EPA, the IRS, the NSA, the FDA, HHS, you just name it, it goes on and on. And these people are supposed to be hired to advise him, but what happens is he may hire these advisors, but they in turn hire massive amounts of bureaucrats. And these bureaucrats are not elected. They're hired by an unelected, in fact, appointed person. So what we've ended up with is this massive executive branch, and it is often referred to as the, quote, fourth branch of government. Now, classically, theoretically, the people are supposed to be the fourth branch of government, and a lot of teachers teach that, and that's the way it's supposed to be. But in fact, it isn't like that at all. The executive branch and all of these agencies have immense amount of control. They take the law that Congress passes, and then what they do is, say example for Obamacare, they take the law, which was huge in and of itself coming out of Congress, having passed out of Congress, but on top of that, they go in and start making all these delineated regulations for every single concept that's in that law. And so you end up with unelected bureaucrats making law, because what they write down as a regulation in order to get this piece of legislation executed becomes the force of law. So essentially they are writing laws, and you are bound to that law. I don't have any inclination to believe that the founders intended the executive branch to be this massive and bloated. Now, of course, you want the president to be able to have his advisors around him to make good decisions. But what has happened is that the Constitution doesn't cover these people legally. They're unelected, and they answer to the president, but there've become so many of them that they've kind of taken on their own life. And essentially, there's no constitutional check on these people. And they're back there, writing regulations that are binding on the people in general, and that's a lot of power. And so they've grown in power immensely over time. And I believe this situation needs to come into check. There needs to be some way to kind of rein in this out of control executive branch. Now, when it comes to this term, the fourth branch of government, you'll hear it used for other entities as well. Some people will refer to it as the lobbyists that come over to the Congress and, kind of woo the congressmen into voting in support of whoever's paying them to lobby. And then that's certainly true as well. So you'll kind of hear this fourth branch of government loosely termed, but having different focuses. But some people even term the media as being the fourth branch of government because they're so overpowering on the government, and they put so much pressure on the government that they wield a lot of power. But nevertheless, it's important to notice that power has risen now. And we are dealing with that, but we have no constitutional way of addressing it. Okay, Section 3 and 4 of Article 2. The President, quote, shall from time to time give the Congress information of the state of the Union, end quote. This clause allows the President to address the Congress on special issues, or if there's disagreements that have come up, he can address the Congress on an extraordinary occasion. Like, say there's a need to go to war, then the President will come in and address the Congress. But in general, he's really not supposed to be around. He needs to be out of those chambers and acting independently. So every year typically, and it's not specified that it has to happen every year, but typically what you'll see in January is a standard State of the Union address. You'll have this concept called the Take Care Clause, and that's basically referring to that statement that says, quote, he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed, end quote. That basically implies that the President is morally and ethically obligated to execute the laws that come before him. Okay, a president can be removed from office, and that is done through impeachment. But he's got to commit treason. He has to accept a bribe or bribe someone. He has to commit a high crime or a pretty strong misdemeanor. Something that's really damaging politically and further damaging his impact on his ability to govern the nation. The 1828 Webster's Dictionary definition of impeachment is an accusation or charge brought against public officers for maladministration in the office. And we will address this a couple of times because there have been cases in the past where this topic of impeachment has come up. But that's going to do it for this article. We will talk about the third and last branch of the government, which is the judicial branch. And that has the least amount of expressed powers in it. They really never intended the judicial branch to have a lot of power because that power can be extremely far-reaching and extremely damaging. And they kind of wanted to keep that branch in check. So we will go over those, but what you're going to find as we go on through this course is that branch has secured a lot of power, and they have taken the implication of power, not the expressed written power. They have taken the implied power that's in their article, and they have extended those fingers way beyond their grasp. Okay, that's a wrap. And I will see you next time in American Government class at GW Bridge Academy.